When you have everything money can buy but no one to share it with, you understand true poverty. Samuel Beckett learned this lesson at 58, sitting alone in his grand ranch house while his fortune meant nothing without an heir. In 1887 Santa Fe, he made Eleanor Price an offer that shocked them both. She was a proud woman who once taught school but now slept behind the church doors. He would give her a home, food, and security. She would give him a child to inherit his legacy. No marriage, no promises of love, just two people helping each other survive. Eleanor accepted because she had nowhere else to turn. Samuel offered because he thought he knew what he wanted. But as the months passed and they shared the same roof, something unexpected began to grow between them. What happens when a business arrangement becomes something neither of them planned for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Beckett ranch as Samuel stood on his wraparound porch, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands. 40,000 acres stretched before him, rolling hills dotted with cattle, fence lines that seemed to touch the horizon, and a house that had once echoed with laughter but now held only the hollow sound of his own footsteps. 3 years had passed since Margaret's death, yet he still wore his wedding ring. The gold band had grown loose on his finger, much like everything else in his life, too big, too empty, too quiet. At 58, Samuel had built an empire from nothing. His grandfather had arrived in New Mexico territory with little more than determination and a horse. His father had expanded their holdings, and Samuel had transformed the family ranch into one of the most successful cattle operations in the Southwest. But success, he'd learned, was a cold companion. The house reflected his prosperity: 2 stories of adobe and timber, with hand-carved furniture shipped from back east and Persian rugs that Margaret had insisted upon. 10 bedrooms, most of which hadn't seen a guest in years. A dining room table that could seat 20, but now accommodated only 1. Every morning he ate breakfast alone while Maria, his housekeeper, moved quietly through the rooms like a ghost tending to a mausoleum. Samuel's reflection stared back at him from the window, glass-grey hair still thick, shoulders broad from decades of ranch work, eyes the color of winter sky. He looked like a man who should have sons learning the business, grandsons riding ponies in the yard, a legacy that extended beyond cattle brands and property deeds. Instead, he had silence and the growing certainty that when he died, everything he'd built would be sold to strangers who'd never understand what it meant. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could buy anything, travel anywhere, command respect from every businessman in 3 territories. Yet he couldn't purchase the one thing that mattered: time to start over, to build the family he'd never had with Margaret. Their marriage had been good, built on mutual respect and genuine affection, but children had never come. Margaret had suffered 3 miscarriages before the doctor advised them to stop trying. They'd grown closer in their shared grief, finding purpose in each other and the ranch, but the absence of children remained a hollow space in their hearts that nothing could fill. Now Margaret was gone, buried in the small cemetery behind the church in Santa Fe, and Samuel faced the reality that his bloodline would end with him. The thought kept him awake nights, staring at the ceiling while wind rattled the windows and reminded him how alone he truly was. In town, people treated him with the deference reserved for wealthy men. They touched their hats, spoke respectfully, and invited him to social gatherings where widows his age smiled hopefully from across parlors. But Samuel had no interest in another marriage of convenience or companionship. What he needed was something more practical, more honest, an arrangement that would give him an heir without the pretense of love he no longer believed in. The idea had been forming for months, crystallizing into something that would have shocked his younger self, but now seemed like the only logical solution. He would find a woman who needed what he could, provide security, respect, a comfortable life in exchange for what he needed most. A child to carry on his name, inherit his legacy, and ensure that 40 years of building something from nothing wouldn't die with him. It was during one of his rare visits to Santa Fe that he first noticed Eleanor Price. She sat on the church steps each evening as the sun set, wrapped in a threadbare shawl that had once been fine wool. Her posture spoke of breeding and education, straight-backed even in poverty, hands folded in her lap, with the precise grace of someone who'd been taught proper deportment. She was perhaps 45, still handsome, despite the wear of hardship. With graying brown hair, she kept pinned neatly despite having no mirror. Samuel learned her story from Father Miguel, the elderly priest who'd taken pity on the woman sleeping behind his church. Eleanor Price had been the territory's most respected teacher, running the school in Las Cruces for nearly 20 years. She'd never married, dedicating herself instead to educating children whose parents often struggled to read themselves. Her small salary had supported not only herself, but also her aging parents until their deaths 2 years prior. The trouble began when Eleanor accepted a mixed-race child into her school, the daughter of a Mexican woman and a traveling merchant. The school board, pressured by some of the town's more prejudiced families, had given Eleanor an ultimatum: remove the child or lose her position. Eleanor had chosen principle over security, and the decision had cost her everything. Without references or savings, she drifted from town to town, seeking work that never materialized. Teaching positions required recommendations she couldn't obtain. Other work was scarce for a woman her age, with no family connections. Pride had prevented her from begging, but poverty had stripped away every other option. Now she existed on charity from the church and occasional odd job-smending clothes, copying letters for illiterate townspeople, tutoring children whose parents could spare a few pennies. She slept in the small room behind the church sacristy, grateful for shelter but acutely aware that she lived on borrowed kindness. Samuel observed her for weeks before approaching. He noted how she kept herself clean despite her circumstances, how she spoke softly but precisely when Father Miguel introduced her to parishioners, how she carried herself with dignity even when accepting charity. She possessed the qualities he needed: intelligence, breeding, and most importantly, desperation that might make her receptive to an unusual proposal. The conversation took place on a Tuesday evening in November, after most of the townspeople had returned to their homes. Samuel approached the church steps where Eleanor sat, reading a worn copy of Tennyson's poems by the fading light. "Miss Price," he said, removing his hat, "I wonder if I might have a word." She looked up, recognizing him as the wealthy rancher who attended Mass occasionally, but kept to himself. "Of course, Mr. Beckett. I have a proposition that may sound strange." Samuel began, choosing his words carefully. "I'm a practical man facing a practical problem. I need an heir, and you need security. I believe we might help each other." Eleanor's education served her well. She understood immediately what he was suggesting, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "I see. I'm not speaking of marriage," Samuel continued. "Rather, a mutually beneficial arrangement. You would live comfortably in my home, want for nothing, and be treated with complete respect. In return, you would bear my child. When the child is born, you would be free to leave with enough money to start over anywhere you choose, or you could remain as the child's governess if you preferred." The silence stretched between them while Eleanor processed the offer. It was scandalous, certainly, but also honest in a way that surprised her. No false declarations of affection, no pretense of romantic love, just two people acknowledging their needs and finding a way to meet them. "You would expect," she began. "Only what's necessary for conception," Samuel said quietly. "Nothing more. You would have your own room, your privacy, and my word that you'd be treated as a lady in my household." Eleanor closed her book, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "Why me?" "Because you're educated, well-bred, and have shown remarkable character in difficult circumstances. Because you understand what it means to sacrifice for principle. Because I believe you would raise a child to have both intelligence and integrity." That night, Eleanor lay awake in her small room behind the church, staring at the ceiling and weighing her options. She could continue as she was, dependent on charity and growing older without prospects, or she could accept this strange offer from a man who at least spoke honestly about his intentions. By morning, she had made her decision. "I accept your proposition, Mr. Beckett," she told him when he returned the next evening, "but I have conditions of my own." Samuel nodded, expecting this from a woman of her intelligence. "I want your word that the child will be acknowledged as yours, given your name, and raised with every advantage. I want assurance that if something happens to you, provisions will be made for the child's care. And I want to understand exactly what my position will be in your household, not as a servant, but not as a wife either." "You'll be treated as an honored guest," Samuel replied. "The mother of my child deserves nothing less." 3 days later, Eleanor Price left the church steps for the last time, carrying her few possessions in a carpet bag that had seen better days. Among her belongings was a leather-bound teaching journal filled with lesson plans and student memories from her years in Las Cruces, only remnant of the life she'd lost and the identity she was leaving behind. As Samuel helped her into his carriage for the journey to his ranch, neither spoke of love or affection. They were two practical people making a practical arrangement, nothing more. But as the miles passed and the vast landscape of Samuel's holdings came into view, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years, that her life might have purpose again, even if not in the way she'd once imagined. The ranch house stood like a monument to success and solitude, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. As they approached, Eleanor saw the life she was entering, comfortable, respected, and utterly unlike anything she'd known. Samuel saw her watching the landscape, her expression thoughtful rather than impressed. "It's beautiful," she said simply. "It's home," Samuel replied, "and now it's yours too for as long as you choose to stay." Neither of them realized that choice would become more complicated than either had imagined. Eleanor's first morning at the Beckett Ranch began before dawn, not from habit, but from the unfamiliarity of comfort. The bed was too soft, the room too quiet, the absence of church bells and street sounds leaving her disoriented in the darkness. She dressed carefully in her best dress-own, of only two she owned, and made her way downstairs, uncertain of her place in this grand house. She found Samuel in the kitchen, already dressed for the day's work, drinking coffee while Maria prepared breakfast. The housekeeper, a woman of perhaps 60 with kind eyes and graying hair, looked up as Eleanor entered. "Buenos dias, Señorita Price," Maria said warmly. "I have prepared breakfast. How do you like your eggs?" The simple question caught Eleanor off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked her preference for anything. "However is convenient," she replied. Samuel looked up from his coffee. "Maria asked how you like them, not what's convenient. This is your home now." Eleanor hesitated. "Scrambled, please, with just a touch of butter." As Maria bustled about the kitchen, Eleanor noticed how the older woman moved with easy familiarity, clearly having run this household for years. Samuel ate in comfortable silence, occasionally glancing at Eleanor as if trying to assess how she was settling in. "I thought you might like to see the rest of the house today," he said finally, "and perhaps meet some of the hands. They'll treat you with respect, but they're curious about our arrangement." Eleanor nodded, understanding the delicate position they both occupied. Their situation would raise eyebrows and generate gossip, but Samuel's wealth and standing would protect them from outright scandal. After breakfast, Samuel showed her through the house rooms filled with furniture that spoke of prosperity, but lacked the personal touches that made a house a home. In what had clearly been Margaret's sitting room, Eleanor noticed a child's primer book tucked behind a cushion, forgotten and gathering dust. "One of the ranch hand's children left it here years ago," Samuel explained, following her gaze. "Maria keeps meaning to return it." Eleanor picked up the small book, its pages worn from use, and felt an unexpected pang of longing. She'd taught hundreds of children to read from books, just like this one, had watched their faces light up as letters became words, words became stories, stories became gateways to larger worlds. "May I keep this?" she asked. "It reminds me of something I used to be good at." Samuel nodded, noting the wistfulness in her voice. "Of course." That afternoon, as Samuel tended to ranch business, Eleanor explored the grounds alone. The November air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and distant mountains. She walked past the stables, where horses whinnied softly, past the bunkhouse where she could hear the ranch hands talking and laughing, past the vegetable garden that Maria tended with obvious pride. At the edge of the property, she found a small bench overlooking a creek that wound through cottonwood trees. She sat down and opened the primer book, running her fingers over the familiar exercises and simple stories. For a moment, she could almost hear her students' voices, reciting their lessons, see their eager faces as they struggled with difficult words. "Miss Eleanor." She looked up to find a young boy of perhaps 8 years old, clearly one of the ranch hand's children. He had dark hair and curious eyes, and he regarded her with the bold directness of youth. "Hello," Eleanor said gently. "What's your name?" "Tommy Rodriguez. My pa works for Mr. Beckett. Are you really going to live here?" Eleanor smiled at his directness. "Yes, I am. My pa says you used to be a teacher. Is that true?" "It is." Tommy's eyes brightened. "I can't read very good. Ma tries to help, but she's got the baby and cooking and everything. Would you maybe—" He stopped, suddenly shy. "Would I what, Tommy?" "Would you maybe help me read better? I got a book, but the words are too hard." Eleanor felt something stir in her chest, something that had been dormant for months. "I'd be happy to help you read, Tommy. What book do you have?" The boy's face lit up as he ran toward the bunkhouse, returning with a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe. Eleanor examined the book, noting its advanced vocabulary, and realized Tommy was far more ambitious than his age suggested. "This is quite a challenging book," she said, "but I think we can work through it together. Would you like to start now?" For the next hour, Eleanor sat with Tommy on the bench, helping him sound out difficult words and explaining concepts beyond his experience. She watched his confidence grow with each page, saw his excitement as the story began to make sense. Samuel found them there as the sun began to set. The woman and boy bent over the book together, Eleanor's voice patient and encouraging as she guided Tommy through a particularly complex passage. "Tommy," Samuel called, "your mother's looking for you." The boy jumped up, clutching his book. "Thank you, Miss Eleanor. Can we read more tomorrow?" "If it's all right with your parents and Mr. Beckett," Eleanor replied. After Tommy ran off, Samuel sat down beside Eleanor on the bench. "He's a bright boy. His father is one of my best hands. He's very intelligent. With proper instruction, he could read anything." Samuel studied her face in the fading light. "You miss it, don't you? Teaching." Eleanor closed the primer book and held it against her chest. "More than I expected. I thought I'd made peace with losing that part of my life, but being around children again, it reminds me of who I used to be." "Maybe you don't have to lose that entirely," Samuel said quietly. That evening, as they sat in the parlor after dinner, Eleanor reading while Samuel reviewed ranch accounts, she became aware of how natural this felt, two people sharing the same space in comfortable silence. It wasn't intimacy, exactly, but it wasn't the cold business arrangement she'd expected either. "Samuel," she said, then stopped, realizing she'd used his first name without permission. "Please," he said, looking up from his ledgers. "We're living in the same house. Formality seems unnecessary. I was wondering about the arrangement we discussed. When do you expect that is? How do we—" Samuel set down his pen, understanding her difficulty in broaching the subject. "We have time, Eleanor. There's no rush. I want you to be comfortable here first." Over the following weeks, Eleanor gradually found her place in the household routine. She helped Maria with lighter chores, not from obligation, but from a desire to contribute. She continued working with Tommy and soon found herself teaching 2 other ranch children whose parents heard about her sessions. Samuel made no objection, seeming pleased to see her skills put to use. The townspeople they encountered on trips to Santa Fe treated Eleanor with careful respect, uncertain of her status, but unwilling to offend Samuel Beckett. Some women whispered behind fans, speculating about the nature of their relationship. Others, particularly those who remembered Eleanor's reputation as a teacher, greeted her warmly. It was during one of these trips that Eleanor encountered Mrs. Henderson, the wife of the man who had orchestrated Eleanor's dismissal from the Las Cruces school. The woman approached Eleanor outside the general store, her expression a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed disapproval. "Eleanor Price," Mrs. Henderson said. "I heard you were living at the Beckett Ranch. In what capacity, I wonder?" Eleanor straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of dignity she'd cultivated during months of poverty. "In whatever capacity Mr. Beckett requires, Mrs. Henderson." "How interesting. And here I thought you'd learned your lesson about making inappropriate choices." Before Eleanor could respond, Samuel appeared at her side, his presence immediately changing the dynamic. "Mrs. Henderson," he said coolly, "I trust you're not troubling Miss Price with unwelcome conversation." Mrs. Henderson's demeanor shifted instantly. "Oh, Mr. Beckett, not at all. I was simply greeting an old acquaintance." "How fortunate for Miss Price," Samuel replied, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. "If you'll excuse us." As they walked away, Eleanor felt something shift between them. Samuel's protection hadn't been calculated, or businesslike, it had been instinctive, almost fierce. She glanced at him, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hand had moved to her arm as if to shield her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "No one has the right to speak to you that way, not anymore." That night, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about the moment outside the store. Samuel's defense of her had felt less like a man protecting his investment and more like something else. Something that made her heart beat a little faster and her cheeks warm with an emotion she hadn't expected to feel again. Downstairs, Samuel sat in his study, staring into the fire and wondering when Eleanor Price had stopped being a solution to his problem and started being a woman whose happiness mattered to him. The realization was both unexpected and unsettling, threatening to complicate an arrangement that was supposed to be simple. Neither of them slept easily that night, both sensing that their carefully constructed boundaries were beginning to blur in ways that would change everything. December brought the first snow to the high country, transforming the ranch into a landscape of pristine white, punctuated by the dark silhouettes of cattle and the warm glow of lamplight from the house. Eleanor had been at the ranch for nearly 2 months, and the rhythms of their shared life had settled into something resembling normalcy. She woke each morning to the sound of Samuel moving quietly through the house, preparing for his day. They shared breakfast while discussing the weather, ranch business, or the progress of her informal school with the children. Eleanor had taken to setting up lessons in the large dining room, where the big table provided space for 3 eager students and their growing collection of books and slates. Samuel had surprised her by ordering additional supplies from Denver proper primers, writing materials, even a small chalkboard that he'd had one of the hands mount on the dining room wall. When Eleanor had protested the expense, he'd merely shrugged. "The children are learning. That's worth the cost," he'd said simply. But it was the evenings that had become their most comfortable time together. After dinner, they would retire to the parlor where Eleanor would read aloud, while Samuel tended to paperwork or simply listened. Her voice had a quality that made even familiar stories seem new, and Samuel found himself looking forward to these quiet hours when the day's work was done and the house felt less empty. Tonight, she was reading from Dickens, her voice giving life to the characters, while snow fell steadily outside the windows. Samuel had long since abandoned any pretense of working, instead watching Eleanor's expressive face as she became lost in the story. "You have a gift for this," he said during a pause. Eleanor looked up, slightly flustered. "For reading aloud?" "For bringing stories to life. Your students were lucky to have you." A shadow crossed her face. "I'm not sure they would agree. My principals cost them their teacher." Samuel set aside his papers and leaned forward. "Tell me about that day, about your decision." Eleanor closed the book, her fingers tracing its leather cover. It was a question she'd been avoiding, both from others and from herself. Her name was Esperanza Martinez, 8 years old, bright as a new penny and eager to learn. Her mother worked for a merchant family, and when they moved to Las Cruces, Esperanza came with them. She paused, remembering the little girl's dark eyes and ready smile. The school board called it inappropriate mixing of races. They said it would upset the other parents, damage the school's reputation. They gave me a choice: remove Esperanza or lose my position. And you chose the child. I chose what was right. Every child deserves education, regardless of their parentage. But my principles didn't help. Esperanza still couldn't attend school, and I couldn't teach anyone. Samuel was quiet for a moment, studying Eleanor's face in the lamplight. What happened to her? To Esperanza? I don't know. The family left Las Cruces soon after. I hope she found another teacher somewhere, someone who could see past the color of her skin to the intelligence beneath. The silence stretched between them, comfortable rather than awkward. Samuel reached into his vest pocket and withdrew his father's pocket watch, a gold timepiece that had been passed down through 3 generations of Beckett men. He opened it, revealing the inscription inside: "Time well spent is never lost. My grandfather gave this to my father, and my father to me." Samuel said, holding it so Eleanor could see. "He told me that a man's legacy isn't measured in gold or cattle, but in the decisions he makes when no one is watching." Eleanor studied the watch, understanding the significance of him sharing this family heirloom. "You think I made the right choice?" "I think you made the only choice a person of conscience could make. The fact that it cost you everything only makes it more admirable." Their eyes met across the small space between their chairs, and Eleanor felt something stir in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Samuel's praise meant more to her than she'd expected, perhaps because it came from a man who seemed to understand the weight of difficult decisions. "I should continue reading," she said, though she made no move to open the book. "Should you?" Samuel's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Eleanor, about our arrangement." The word hung between them like a barrier. Arrangement. The clinical term for what had brought them together seemed increasingly inadequate to describe what was developing between them. "What about it?" Eleanor asked, though her heart was beating faster. Samuel seemed to struggle with his words. "I want you to know that there's no pressure, no expectation that you're not, until you're truly comfortable here, with me." Eleanor set the book aside and folded her hands in her lap. "And if I never become comfortable with that aspect of our agreement?" The question clearly pained him. "Then we'll find another way. I won't force intimacy, Eleanor. What we have now, this companionship, it's more than I expected. More than I had before you came." "You're lonely," Eleanor said softly, the realization sudden and clear. "I was lonely," Samuel corrected. "I'm not anymore." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, moved by his sincerity and by the recognition of her own loneliness, which had lifted so gradually she'd barely noticed its absence. "Samuel," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what she was feeling. "What is it?" "I was lonely too, for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone to talk to share meals with, matter to someone again." Samuel rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "We weren't supposed to matter to each other. This was meant to be practical, uncomplicated." Eleanor joined him at the window, standing close enough to catch the scent of leather and sage that always seemed to cling to him. "Are you sorry that it's become more complicated?" He turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "No. God help me, no. I should be. It would be easier, but I'm not." They stood there in the soft lamplight, snow falling beyond the window, the space between them charged with possibility and uncertainty. Eleanor felt as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing that one step forward would change everything. "The children have been asking if I'll be here for Christmas," she said finally, stepping back from the moment's intensity. Samuel seemed to gather himself, his expression clearing. "Will you be? If you want me to be." I want you to be here for Christmas and New Year's. And he stopped himself, as if he'd been about to say too much. And, Eleanor prompted gently. Samuel smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. And for as long as you'll stay. That night, Eleanor lay in her comfortable bed, staring at the ceiling while snow continued to fall outside her window. The pocket watch's inscription echoed in her mind. Time well spent is never lost. She wondered if the time she was spending here, growing closer to a man she'd agreed to help in the most intimate way possible, qualified as time well spent. Downstairs, Samuel sat in his study, the pocket watch open on his desk beside papers he couldn't concentrate on reading. He'd shown Eleanor the watch because he'd wanted her to understand something about legacy, about choices that mattered. But he was beginning to realize that his own choices were becoming more complex by the day. He was falling in love with Eleanor Price, and he had no idea what to do about it. January arrived with a blizzard that lasted 3 days, trapping everyone on the ranch and forcing an intimacy that neither Samuel nor Eleanor had anticipated. The house, large as it was, seemed to shrink as they found themselves sharing space in ways their careful routines had previously avoided. On the second morning of the storm, Eleanor discovered Samuel in his workshop, behind the kitchen, a room she'd never entered before. The space smelled of wood shavings and linseed oil, filled with tools and half-finished projects that spoke of a man who worked with his hands as much as his mind. "I didn't know you were a carpenter," Eleanor said, watching him plane a piece of pine with practiced strokes. Samuel looked up, a curl of wood shaving caught in his hair. "My father believed a man should be able to build what he needs with his own hands. I find it peaceful work." Eleanor stepped closer, noting the careful joinery and smooth finish of his projects. "What are you making?" Samuel hesitated, his hands stilling on the plane. "A cradle," he said finally. "I thought, that is, I assumed we might need one eventually." The words hung between them, a reminder of the physical aspect of their arrangement that they'd been carefully avoiding. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but also something else, flutter of anticipation that surprised her. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers along the smooth rails he'd carved, with simple but elegant curves. "The baby will be fortunate to have something made with such care." "Our baby," Samuel said quietly, then looked startled at his own words. "I mean, our baby," Eleanor repeated, tasting the words. "Yes, that's what it would be, wouldn't it?" The storm outside seemed to intensify, wind howling around the house and rattling windows. Samuel set down his tools and faced Eleanor directly. "We need to talk about this, don't we? About how?" Eleanor nodded, her heart racing. "I've been wondering the same thing. We can't continue indefinitely as we are. The arrangement—" "Damn the arrangement," Samuel said with sudden vehemence. "Eleanor, what's happening between us? It's not what either of us planned." She moved to the small window, watching snow swirl in the grey light. "What is it then?" Samuel joined her at the window, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I don't know. Friendship, partnership, something more?" Eleanor turned to face him and found herself looking up into eyes that held warmth, uncertainty, and something deeper that made her breath catch. "Samuel, I need you to know I've never, that is, I have no experience with intimacy," he finished gently. She nodded, embarrassment warming her cheeks. "I always thought there would be marriage first, love, the proper order of things. This arrangement, it's so different from what I imagined my life would be." Samuel reached out slowly, giving her time to step away, and touched her face with calloused fingers. "It doesn't have to be cold or businesslike, Eleanor. We care for each other, I know we do. That's more than many marriages begin with." Eleanor leaned into his touch, surprised by how natural it felt. "Are you saying you care for me?" "I'm saying I wake up each morning looking forward to sharing breakfast with you. I'm saying your voice reading aloud has become my favorite sound. I'm saying that when Mrs. Henderson spoke rudely to you, I wanted to defend you not because of our arrangement, but because—" He stopped, as if afraid to finish the thought. "Because, why?" Because you matter to me, more than I expected, more than is probably wise." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, moved by his honesty and by the recognition of her own growing feelings. "You matter to me too, Samuel. These months living here, they've been the happiest I've had in years. Not because of the comfort or security, but because of you. Because of the way you listen when I talk about the children. Because you defend my choices, even when they cost me everything. Because you see me as more than just a means to an end." The workshop fell silent except for the storm outside and the sound of their breathing. Samuel's thumb traced her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes? When you're ready, not because of our agreement, but because you want to, I'd like to court you properly, the way you deserve to be courted before." Eleanor's heart fluttered. "Court me? But we're already living together. Already committed to." "To an arrangement," Samuel interrupted. "I want something real with you, something that isn't based on mutual need but on mutual choice." Eleanor studied his face, seeing sincerity in every line. "And if courting leads, where courting usually leads." Samuel's smile was gentle, transformative. "Then we'd be creating a child from affection rather than obligation, from caring rather than contract. And if it doesn't, if I'm not capable of what you need, then we'll have whatever we can have, and it will be enough because it's honest." Eleanor stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, a gentle brush of lips that felt momentous. "I'd like that, Samuel. I'd like to be courted by you." The storm passed the next day, but something had fundamentally shifted between them. Samuel began bringing Eleanor small gifts, wildflowers preserved from the summer, pressed between book pages, a hair ribbon from his next trip to town, a smooth stone from the creek that caught the light in interesting ways. Eleanor found herself taking extra care with her appearance, pinning her hair in softer styles and wearing the one good dress she owned more frequently. She began staying up later in the evenings, reluctant to end their time together, and waking earlier to share longer breakfasts. Their conversations deepened, ranging from childhood memories to dreams for the future. Eleanor spoke of her years teaching, her pride in watching children master reading and arithmetic. Samuel shared stories of building the ranch, of his marriage to Margaret, and the grief that had shaped his recent years. "She would have liked you," he said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Margaret appreciated intelligence and principle." "I wish I could have known her," Eleanor replied, meaning it. "She must have been remarkable to earn your devotion." "She was, but Eleanor," Samuel paused, choosing his words carefully. "What I felt for Margaret, what I'm beginning to feel for you, they're different things. Not better or worse, but different. Margaret and I grew into love slowly, over years. With you, it feels like recognition, as if I've been waiting to meet you without knowing it." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "Is that what this is? Love?" Samuel set down his coffee cup and moved to kneel beside her chair. "I don't know what else to call it. Do you?" Eleanor looked down at his upturned face, seeing vulnerability and hope in his expression. "I call it unexpected," she said softly. "I call it frightening and wonderful, and completely different from anything I imagined. But do you call it love?" Eleanor touched his face, memorizing the feel of his skin beneath her palm. "I call it the beginning of love, the possibility of love, the hope of it." Samuel caught her hand and pressed it to his lips. "That's enough for now, more than enough." Outside, the snow-covered landscape stretched endlessly under starlight. But inside the warm house, two people who had found each other through necessity were discovering something that felt very much like destiny. Spring came early to New Mexico territory, transforming the ranch from winter's stark beauty into a landscape of gentle greens and wildflowers. Eleanor had been at the Beckett Ranch for 5 months, and what had begun as careful coexistence had blossomed into something resembling a true partnership. She now helped Samuel with the ranch's bookkeeping, her neat handwriting replacing his cramped scrawl in the ledgers. Her mathematical skills, honed through years of teaching, brought order to accounts that had grown increasingly complex as the operation expanded. Samuel found himself seeking her opinion on business decisions, valuing her thoughtful analysis and different perspective. "The Hendersons want to buy 50 head," Samuel said one morning, spreading papers across the breakfast table. "They're offering fair price, but I'm not inclined to do business with them." Eleanor looked up from her coffee, understanding immediately. Mrs. Henderson's rudeness outside the general store had not been forgotten. Personal feelings aside, are they reliable buyers? Yes, unfortunately. They pay on time and treat the cattle well. Eleanor studied the figures, then looked at Samuel's face. "What does your practical side tell you?" "Take the money. Business is business." "And your heart?" Samuel smiled wryly. "Tells me that some people don't deserve the courtesy of commerce." Eleanor reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, a gesture that had become natural between them. "Then follow your heart. We're doing well enough to choose our partners." It was true. Under Eleanor's organizational skills and Samuel's expanding vision, the ranch was more profitable than ever. But more importantly, Samuel had found purpose beyond mere accumulation of wealth. He was building something he could be proud to leave behind, not just for his future child, but for the community that depended on his success. One afternoon, while Samuel met with potential buyers from Denver, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor. She was teaching her small class in the dining room when Maria announced that a lady had come to call. Eleanor found a woman of perhaps 40 waiting in the parlor, elegantly dressed, but with kind eyes that seemed vaguely familiar. The visitor rose as Eleanor entered, extending a gloved hand. "Miss Price? I'm Catherine Morrison. I believe you knew my daughter Sarah when you taught in Las Cruces." Recognition dawned. Sarah Morrison had been one of Eleanor's brightest students, a girl with an insatiable curiosity about literature and history. Eleanor remembered her fondly as a child who asked thoughtful questions and challenged conventional thinking. "Mrs. Morrison, of course. How is Sarah?" "Thriving, thanks in large part to your influence. She's attending the Teachers' College in Denver now, determined to follow in your footsteps." Catherine Morrison paused, her expression growing serious. "That's actually why I'm here." Eleanor gestured for her guest to sit, sensing important news. "Please, tell me." "There's been a development in Las Cruces. The school board that dismissed you has been disbanded following a scandal involving misappropriated funds. The new board is actively seeking to restore the school's reputation by hiring teachers of unquestionable character and ability." Eleanor's heart began to race. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying they want you back, Miss Price. Not just as a teacher, but as the head instructor, full authority over curriculum and enrollment policies. They've specifically stated that all qualified children would be welcome, regardless of background." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Everything she'd lost, a career, her purpose, her independence, was being offered back to her. The injustice that had cost her everything had finally been acknowledged and corrected. "They're prepared to offer you a substantial salary," Catherine continued, "and a house on the school grounds. You could start fresh, with the respect and authority you always deserved." Eleanor stared out the window at the ranch that had become her home, her mind reeling. In the distance, she could see Tommy Rodriguez helping his father with the horses, the boy who had reminded her of her love for teaching. Near the barn, Samuel's tall figure was visible as he gestured to the Denver buyers, conducting business with the quiet authority she'd come to admire. "When would they need an answer?" Eleanor asked quietly. "They're hoping to have someone in place by fall. Miss Price, Eleanor, know your current situation must be comfortable, but teaching is your calling. Sarah often speaks of how you changed her life, opened her mind to possibilities she'd never imagined. There are hundreds of other children who need what you have to give." After Catherine Morrison left, Eleanor sat alone in the parlor, her mother's locket clutched in her trembling hands. The silver pendant contained a daguerreotype of her parents, taken shortly after their marriage. Her mother wore a simple dress, but radiated happiness, her father's hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Eleanor opened the locket and studied their young faces. Her mother had been a teacher too, before marriage and children claimed her attention. She'd often told Eleanor that teaching was the most noble profession, that shaping young minds was a sacred trust. Her parents had dreamed of grandchildren who would carry on their values, but they died before Eleanor's life had taken this unexpected turn. What would they think of her current situation? Would they understand the choice she'd made to accept Samuel's proposal? Would they approve of the feelings that had grown between them, or would they see her as compromising her principles for security? Samuel found her there an hour later, still clutching the locket, tears streaming down her face. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" He knelt beside her chair, taking her free hand in both of his. "Has something happened?" Eleanor looked at him through her tears, seeing concern and affection in his weathered features. How could she explain that she'd just been offered everything she'd once dreamed of, but that accepting it would mean leaving everything she'd come to treasure? "I had a visitor today," she said finally. "Catherine Morrison, the mother of one of my former students." Samuel waited patiently as Eleanor explained the offer, his expression growing more guarded with each word. "They want me back," she concluded. "Full reinstatement, authority over enrollment, everything I lost when I chose principle over practicality." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. "And what do you want?" "I don't know," Eleanor whispered. 6 months ago, I would have wept with gratitude for such an opportunity. Teaching was my life, my identity. But now you have a different life." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. "Eleanor," Samuel said gently, "look at me." She raised her eyes to his, seeing pain there, but also something that looked like understanding. "If you want to go, if this is what you need, I won't stand in your way. Our arrangement, it was never meant to trap you. You're free to choose whatever path brings you fulfillment. And if I choose to stay," Samuel's hand tightened on hers, "then I'll count myself the most fortunate man in the territory. But what about your need for an heir? What about the future you planned?" Samuel stood and moved to the window, his shoulders tense. "I've been thinking about that, about what kind of legacy I really want to leave behind. Maybe it's not just about blood and name. Maybe it's about the lives we touch, the good we do while we're here." Eleanor joined him at the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "You're saying you could be content without children?" "I'm saying I could be content with you, whatever that means. If children come, wonderful. If they don't, we'll find other ways to make our lives meaningful." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his steadiness. "I need time to think." "Take all the time you need," Samuel said, though she could hear the effort it cost him to sound so calm. "This decision has to be yours alone." That night, Eleanor lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mother's locket on the bedside table catching moonlight. Outside her window, the ranch stretched endlessly under stars, beautiful and peaceful, and somehow incomplete without the promise of children's laughter in its future. She thought of Sarah Morrison, studying to become a teacher because Eleanor had inspired her. She thought of Tommy Rodriguez, whose reading had improved dramatically under her guidance. She thought of Esperanza Martinez, the little girl whose need for education had cost Eleanor everything but led her to this moment. And she thought of Samuel, sleeping alone in his room down the hall, offering her freedom while hoping she would choose to stay. By morning, Eleanor knew she faced the most important decision of her life, one that would define not just her future but the kind of woman she chose to be. The week following Catherine Morrison's visit passed in careful normalcy, as if both Samuel and Eleanor were afraid that discussing the Las Cruces offer might force a decision neither was ready to face. They maintained their routine shared breakfasts, afternoon lessons with the children, quiet evenings by the fire, but underneath the surface, tension hummed like a barely audible note. Eleanor found herself cataloguing small moments. The way Samuel's eyes crinkled when Tommy Rodriguez successfully read a difficult passage, how he unconsciously hummed while reviewing his ledgers, the gentleness with which he handled a newborn calf. She was memorizing him, she realized, as if preparing for a goodbye she wasn't certain she wanted to make. Samuel, meanwhile, watched Eleanor with the intensity of a man trying to understand a mystery. He noted how she lingered at breakfast, reluctant to end their conversations. He saw her gaze drift toward the horizon during her walks, as if she could see Las Cruces in the distance. Most telling of all, he observed how she'd begun organizing her few possessions, a subtle preparation that made his chest tight with impending loss. It was during one of these quiet, loaded days that Eleanor made a discovery that changed everything. She was helping Maria in the kitchen when the older woman mentioned needing to visit her sister in Santa Fe, who was recovering from a difficult birth. Her fourth child, Maria said, needing bread with practiced efficiency. At 42, she thought she was past such possibilities. The midwife says both mother and baby are healthy, but she needs help with the older children. Eleanor paused in her task of peeling potatoes. 42? I thought, that is, I believed women my age were unlikely to. Maria looked up, understanding dawning in her kind eyes. Ah, Señorita Eleanor, you are thinking of yourself, yes? Let me tell you, my sister is not unusual. My own grandmother bore her last child at 45. Women of our family, we are blessed with long fertility. That afternoon, Eleanor walked to her favorite spot by the creek, carrying with her a pressed wildflower she'd kept in her journal since her first week at the ranch. She'd found it during her initial exploration of the property, a small purple bloom that had somehow survived the harsh New Mexico sun. She'd pressed it between pages about lesson plans and student progress, but now it seemed to represent something different, the unexpected beauty that could flourish in unlikely places. Sitting on the familiar bench, Eleanor held the delicate flower up to the light. At 45, she'd assumed her childbearing years were behind her, making Samuel's proposal seem like a transaction with limited physical expectations. But if Maria was right, if women in this territory commonly bore children well into their 40s, then the arrangement they'd made carried far more significant implications than she'd realized. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, she felt a flutter of something that might have been anticipation. Mind if I join you? Eleanor looked up to find Samuel approaching, his hat in his hands and uncertainty in his posture. Over the past week, he'd been giving her space to think, but she could see the strain of waiting in the lines around his eyes. Please, Eleanor said, moving slightly to make room on the bench. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the creek flow over sun-warmed stones. Finally, Samuel spoke. I've been thinking about what you said, about teaching being your calling. I want you to know that if you decide to return to Las Cruces, I'll make sure you're comfortable there. The house, furnishings, whatever you need to start fresh. Eleanor studied his profile, noting the tight control in his voice. You're trying to make it easier for me to leave. I'm trying to do what's right for you, even if it's not what I want. And what do you want, Samuel? He turned to face her, and she saw raw honesty in his expression. I want you to stay. I want to wake up every morning knowing you'll be across the breakfast table. I want to hear you reading to the children, see you organizing my accounts, feel you beside me in the evenings. I want... He stopped, as if he'd revealed too much. What else do you want? Samuel was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I want to make a child with you, Eleanor, not because of our arrangement, but because I love you. Because I want to see your intelligence and kindness reflected in a son or daughter who calls us both parent. Eleanor's breath caught. You love me? God help me, yes. I know it wasn't part of our agreement. I know it complicates everything, but I can't pretend otherwise anymore. Eleanor set the pressed flower aside and turned to face him fully. Samuel, look at me. He raised his eyes to hers, and she saw fear there, fear of rejection, of loss, of having admitted too much. I love you too, she said simply. The words hung between them like a bridge, spanning the distance they'd maintained since Catherine Morrison's visit. Samuel reached for her hands, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Eleanor, I love the way you defend me without being asked, she continued, needing to say it all. I love how you listen when I talk about the children, how you've created a place for me here that feels like home. I love your kindness, your integrity, the way you've never once made me feel like an obligation or burden. Samuel lifted their joined hands and pressed her fingers to his lips. Then stay. Marry me properly, not because of an arrangement, but because we choose each other. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. What about children? What if I can't? What if we never? Then we'll love each other, Samuel said firmly. We'll be godparents to Tommy and the other children you teach. We'll find ways to nurture the next generation that don't require our own blood. But Eleanor, if children do come— They might, Eleanor interrupted, thinking of Maria's words. I spoke with Maria today. She says women in her family often bear children into their 40s. I may not be as past such possibilities as I believed. Samuel's eyes widened. Are you saying— I'm saying that if we choose each other, if we build a real marriage based on love rather than necessity, children might be part of that future. Samuel stood abruptly and began pacing beside the creek, running his hands through his hair. Eleanor, I need you to be certain. If you choose me, choose this life. I want it to be because it's truly what you want, not because you feel obligated by our original agreement. Eleanor rose and caught his arm, stopping his restless movement. Samuel Beckett, are you asking me to marry you? He stilled, looking down at her with an expression of wonder and hope. Yes, I'm asking you to be my wife, my partner, the mother of whatever children God grants us. I'm asking you to help me build something beautiful on this land, something that will outlast both of us. Eleanor thought of the teaching position waiting in Las Cruces, of the vindication and respect it represented. Then she thought of the life she'd built here, of the man standing before her with his heart in his eyes, of the possibility of children who would carry both their strengths into the future. Yes, she said, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I choose this life, this love, this future we'll build together. Samuel swept her into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed with pure joy. When he set her down, they were both breathing hard, their faces flushed with happiness and the promise of what was to come. When? Samuel asked, his forehead resting against hers. Soon, Eleanor replied. I want to write to Catherine Morrison tomorrow, to decline the Las Cruces position respectfully. Then I want to marry you and begin our real life together. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Eleanor left the pressed wildflower on the bench where she'd made her choice. It had served its purpose, marking the moment when an arrangement became love, when two lonely people decided to build a family from hope rather than necessity. That night, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Eleanor fell asleep, thinking not of the past she'd lost, but of the future she was choosing to create. 3 weeks after their engagement, Eleanor discovered the document that changed everything. She hadn't meant to pry. Samuel had asked her to retrieve some business papers from his study while he met with cattle buyers, and she'd been searching through his desk drawer when her fingers found a folder marked Personal Legal Documents. Inside, beneath Samuel's property deeds and business contracts, lay a will dated just 2 weeks before their first meeting at the church steps. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the formal language, but the meaning was devastatingly clear. The will left the entire Beckett estate to any legitimate child born of my blood, with detailed provisions for the child's education, care, and eventual inheritance. A separate clause appointed a Denver law firm as trustees until the child reached majority. Her name appeared only once, in a brief paragraph near the end. To Eleanor Price, in gratitude for services rendered, the sum of $5,000, sufficient to establish herself respectably in any location she may choose. Services rendered. The clinical phrase hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She sank into Samuel's chair, the document shaking in her hands as the full implications became clear. This will had been written before Samuel knew her, before their quiet dinners and shared laughter, before the morning he'd defended her against Mrs. Henderson's rudeness. It had been written when she was nothing more than a solution to his problema vessel for his heir. But what made her feel truly sick was the date. The will was recent enough that Samuel could have changed it after their relationship deepened, after they'd spoken of love and marriage and building a future together. Yet here it remained, unchanged, reducing her to a paid service provider in the most intimate arrangement imaginable. Eleanor forced herself to read the document again, searching for some clause or codicil that might indicate Samuel's changed feelings. She found none. According to this legal instrument, their engagement, their declarations of love, their plans for a real marriageogeny of it, had prompted Samuel to reconsider how he truly viewed her role in his life. The sound of boots on the front porch made Eleanor quickly return the papers to their folder and close the desk drawer. She grabbed the cattle inventory Samuel had requested and hurried from the study, her mind reeling. Samuel entered the parlor moments later, his face brightened by the successful business meeting. "The Denver buyers are taking 200 head at premium prices," he announced, then stopped at the sight of Eleanor's pale face. "What's wrong? You look as though you've seen a ghost." Eleanor handed him the inventory sheets, her hands surprisingly steady. "I found the papers you needed. The meeting went well?" "Very well." "Eleanor, are you feeling unwell? You seem—" "I'm fine," Eleanor interrupted, though the lie tasted bitter. "Perhaps I'll rest before dinner." She escaped to her room, closing the door and leaning against it as if she could shut out the knowledge that had shattered her newfound happiness. For the first time in months, she felt the walls of the house pressing in on her, reminding her that she was here by arrangement, not by right. That evening at dinner, Eleanor struggled to maintain normal conversation while Samuel spoke enthusiastically about expanding their cattle operation. She watched his animated face and wondered how she'd been so naive as to believe their arrangement had truly transformed into something deeper. "I've been thinking," Samuel said, cutting into his beef with obvious satisfaction. "Once we're married, I'd like to add your name to some of the ranch accounts, make you a true partner in the business." Eleanor set down her fork, her appetite completely gone. "How generous of you." Samuel paused, clearly noting the coldness in her tone. "Eleanor, what's troubling you? You've been distant since this afternoon." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "Tell me about your will, Samuel." The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Samuel's fork stilled halfway to his mouth, and Eleanor saw understanding dawn in his eyes along with something that might have been guilt. "Eleanor, I can explain." "Can you? Because what I read this afternoon suggested that despite all our talk of love and marriage and partnership, you still view me exactly as you did that first night at the church steps, a service provider, a means to an end." Samuel set down his utensils and leaned forward, his voice urgent. "That's not true. That will was written before I knew you. Before." "Before what, Samuel? Before you realized I might be useful in other ways? Before you discovered that kindness costs less than cruelty? Before you decided that a contented broodmare produces healthier offspring?" "Damn it, Eleanor, that's not—" Samuel stopped, visibly controlling his temper. "That will doesn't reflect how I feel about you now." "Then why haven't you changed it?" Eleanor's voice was deadly quiet. "You've had months to alter those provisions, to include me as more than a footnote, receiving payment for services rendered. Why is it that your legal documents still treat our future child as your sole heir and me as temporary help?" Samuel ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Eleanor had once found endearing, but now saw as calculation. "I haven't thought about the will since." "You haven't thought about it?" Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Samuel, that document represents your true intentions. Everything else, the courtship, the declarations of love, the promise of partnership, those are just methods of ensuring my cooperation." "That's not true, and you know it." "Eleanor, sit down. Let me explain." But Eleanor was beyond listening to explanations. The hurt and betrayal she felt were too sharp, too reminiscent of every other time she'd trusted someone's promises, only to discover their true priorities. "I won't be staying for the explanation," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "In fact, I won't be staying at all." Samuel shot to his feet. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm accepting the position in Las Cruces. I'll leave first thing in the morning." "Eleanor, please. Don't make a decision based on hurt feelings and a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Eleanor's composure finally cracked. "Samuel, I found your will by accident, but it revealed the truth by design. You want a child to inherit your legacy, and you're willing to be kind to me to get one. But at the end of the day, I remain what I was from the beginning, a hired service." Samuel moved around the table toward her, his hands outstretched. "Eleanor, I love you, regardless of what that damned will says. I love you. Marry me, and we'll write a new will together. We'll make it right." Eleanor stepped back, shaking her head. "Love doesn't exist in documents, Samuel, but intentions do, and yours were made clear long before you knew me well enough to love me. I'm not angry about the will itself. I'm angry that you never trusted me enough to discuss it, never cared enough to change it. I was going to change it after we married." "After," Eleanor repeated bitterly. "Always after with you, isn't it? After I'm committed, after I'm compromised, after I have nowhere else to go." She moved toward the stairs, then paused. "You know what hurts most, Samuel? For a few weeks, I actually believed I mattered to you as more than a solution to your problem. I thought we were building something real together, but that will written when you barely knew me and unchanged, despite months of supposed courtship that will tells the truth about how you really see me. Eleanor, don't leave like this, not over a piece of paper." "It's not just a piece of paper," Eleanor said from the foot of the stairs. "It's your true intentions, documented and witnessed. And it shows me that no matter what pretty words you speak, you still see me exactly as you did that first night, as a woman desperate enough to accept any arrangement, even one that reduces me to a paid service." Samuel stood alone in the dining room, long after Eleanor's footsteps faded on the stairs above. He stared at the abandoned dinner, the half-empty wine glasses, the carefully set table that had become a battlefield. For the first time since Eleanor had come to live at his ranch, the house felt cold and empty. He thought about the will she'd discovered, about the words he'd written when she was nothing more than a theoretical solution to his need for an heir. He tried to remember why he hadn't changed those provisions as his feelings for Eleanor deepened. But the truth was exactly what she'd accused him of, simply hadn't thought about it. The realization made him feel sick. He'd been so focused on winning Eleanor's affection, on building their relationship day by day, that he'd forgotten about the legal document that reduced their future to a business transaction. In trying to court her properly, he'd failed to address the underlying framework that made their entire relationship feel conditional. Upstairs, Eleanor packed her few belongings with mechanical precision, her movements sharp with anger and hurt. She folded her dresses, wrapped her books, and placed her mother's locket carefully in its small jewelry box. The pressed wildflower from their afternoon by the creek lay forgotten on her bedside table, a symbol of hope that now seemed foolishly naive. Tomorrow, she would return to Las Cruces, to the teaching position that would restore her independence and self-respect. She would build a life based on her own merits, rather than her usefulness to someone else's plans. As she closed her carpet bag, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked older than her years, worn by disappointment, and the knowledge that she'd almost made the same mistake, twice trusting a man's kindness to mean more than it actually did. But this time, she would choose herself first. This time, she would walk away with her dignity intact, even if it meant leaving her heart behind. Eleanor woke before dawn on what was to be her last morning at the Beckett Ranch. She'd spent the night staring at the ceiling, her packed bags sitting by the door like sentinels guarding her resolve. Every sound in the house had made her tense Samuel's restless pacing in his study until well past midnight. The creak of floorboards as he finally climbed the stairs, the telling silence from his room that suggested he was sleeping no better than she was. She dressed carefully in her traveling dress, the same worn but respectable garment she'd arrived in 8 months ago. It felt strange to be leaving in the same clothes, as if the intervening time had been nothing more than an elaborate dream. But when she caught sight of herself in the mirror, she saw the changes the months had run. Her face was softer, her posture more confident, her eyes holding depths that hadn't been there when she'd slept behind the church. Samuel had changed her, even if she wasn't sure she could forgive him. Downstairs, she found him waiting in the kitchen, fully dressed despite the early hour. He looked haggard, his hair uncombed and his shirt wrinkled, as if he'd slept in his clothes. 2 cups of coffee sat cooling on the table, along with a plate of biscuits that neither of them would touch. "You're really leaving," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Yes." "Eleanor, please, give me a chance to make this right. Let me explain about the will, about why I never changed it." "There's nothing to explain, Samuel. You wrote down your true intentions before you knew me, and you never cared enough to alter them once you did. That tells me everything I need to know about my place in your life." Samuel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Damn it, Eleanor, that's not how I feel about you." Eleanor picked up her coffee with steady hands. "How you feel and how you act are 2 different things. Your feelings may have changed, but your legal documents haven't. And when it comes to matters of inheritance and legacy, the things that truly matter to you, you still see me exactly as you did that first night." "That's not true." "Isn't it? Tell me, Samuel, if I had borne you a child and then died in childbirth, what would have happened to me? According to your will, I would have received $5,000 for my services. The child would have inherited everything, and I would have been what? A footnote in the Beckett family history?" Samuel's face went white. "Eleanor, you can't think I would have. I think you would have been appropriately grateful. I think you would have mourned me in your way. But I also think that will reflect exactly how expendable you consider me to be." The sound of an approaching wagon interrupted their tense conversation. Through the window, Eleanor could see the livery stable owner from Santa Fe, arriving as scheduled to take her to town for the morning stage. "That's my transportation," Eleanor said, setting down her untouched coffee and moving toward her bags. Samuel stepped into her path. "Eleanor, I'm begging you, don't leave like this. Stay and let me prove that you matter to me. Let me show you that what we have is real." For a moment, Eleanor wavered. She could see genuine pain in Samuel's eyes, could hear the desperation in his voice. Part of her wanted to believe that his feelings were sincere, that the will was simply an oversight rather than a revelation of his true priorities. But then she remembered the careful language of the document, the precision with which it had been crafted to ensure his heir received everything, while she received almost nothing. That level of legal detail wasn't accidental, it was intentional, planned, a reflection of Samuel's deepest beliefs about their arrangement. "I can't," she said quietly. "Samuel, I can't build a life with someone who sees me as temporary, replaceable, expendable. I won't be a means to your end, no matter how kindly you treat me in the process." She picked up her bags and moved toward the door, but Samuel caught her arm. "If you leave now, you'll never know what we might have built together. You'll spend the rest of your life wondering if you made the right choice." Eleanor looked up into his face, memorizing the lines around his eyes, the scar on his jaw from a long-ago accident, the grey threading through his dark hair. "And if I stay, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if your kindness is genuine or calculated. I'd rather live with questions than live with doubt." She gently pulled free of his grasp and walked out of the kitchen, through the house that had become home, and onto the porch where the wagon waited. The driver, a weathered man named Pete, who'd known Samuel for years, tipped his hat respectfully. "Morning, Miss Price. You ready for town?" "Yes, thank you." Pete loaded her bags while Eleanor stood on the porch, looking out over the ranch one last time. The sun was rising over the eastern hills, painting everything in golden light, the pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, the barn where Samuel had shown her his workshop, the creek where they'd sat together and talked of love and future. Samuel appeared behind her, his presence as familiar as breathing. "Eleanor." She didn't turn around. "Yes? I want you to have this." She felt him press something into her hand, a photograph in a silver frame. Looking down, she saw an image she'd never seen before. Herself and Samuel standing together on the front porch, captured by a traveling photographer who'd stopped at the ranch the previous month. In the picture, they were both smiling, Samuel's hand resting lightly on Eleanor's shoulder, their faces turned toward each other with obvious affection. "He gave me this copy last week," Samuel said quietly. "I was going to surprise you with it after we married. I wanted you to have something to remember that what we had was real, even if it's ending." Eleanor stared at the photograph, seeing in their captured faces the happiness she'd felt during those brief weeks when she'd believed in their future together. They looked like a couple in love, like two people who'd found something precious and unexpected. "Samuel." "Miss Price," Pete called from the wagon. "We need to get moving if you're going to make the morning stage." Eleanor clutched the photograph against her chest and climbed into the wagon without looking back. As Pete clicked to the horses and they began moving down the ranch road, she finally allowed herself to turn and see Samuel standing alone on the porch, his hands at his sides, his face a mask of loss and regret. The journey to Santa Fe passed in a blur of familiar landscape and churning emotions. Eleanor tried to focus on the future, the teaching position waiting for her, the respect and independence she would regain, the life she could build based on her own merits rather than someone else's need. But her fingers kept tracing the edges of the photograph, and her mind kept replaying moments from the past 8 months, Samuel defending her against Mrs. Henderson's rudeness, his patient attention during their evening conversations, the way he'd looked at her when he'd confessed his love by the creek. Had all of that been calculation? Had his kindness been nothing more than a strategy to ensure her cooperation? Or had his feelings been genuine, even if his legal preparations suggested otherwise? By the time they reached Santa Fe, Eleanor felt exhausted by the circular nature of her thoughts. She arranged for her trunk to be forwarded to Las Cruces, purchased her stage ticket, and settled into the cramped coach that would take her back to her former life. As the stage pulled away from Santa Fe, Eleanor pressed her face to the window for one last look at the landscape that had become so familiar. Somewhere in those rolling hills was the ranch where she'd experienced her first taste of genuine contentment, where she'd learned what it felt like to be valued and protected, and she'd thought loved. The other passengers in the coach were strangers, their conversations a meaningless buzz around Eleanor's private grief. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself back in a classroom, surrounded by eager young faces, doing work that mattered and made a difference. But instead of feeling excited about reclaiming her calling, she felt hollow, as if she were leaving behind not just Samuel, but a part of herself that had finally been allowed to bloom. The photograph in her hands showed two people who looked genuinely happy together, genuinely committed to building something beautiful. Eleanor studied their faces, searching for signs of deception or calculation, but all she could see was affection and hope. Perhaps that was the cruelest part of all, not knowing whether Samuel's feelings had been real or whether she'd been foolish enough to mistake kindness for love, strategy for sincerity. The uncertainty would follow her to Las Cruces and beyond, a question that might never find an answer. As the miles stretched between Eleanor and the Beckett Ranch, she wondered if Samuel was right, if she would spend the rest of her life wondering whether she'd made the right choice. But she also knew that some risks were too great to take, some trust too precious to gamble with. She had chosen dignity over doubt, independence over uncertainty. Whether that choice would bring her happiness remained to be seen, but at least it would let her sleep at night, knowing she'd protected what remained of her heart. The stage rolled on toward Las Cruces, carrying Eleanor toward a future that felt both familiar and foreign, while behind her, the man she'd loved or thought she'd loved faced the consequences of intentions he'd never thought to change. Eleanor had been in Las Cruces for 3 weeks when the telegram arrived. She was in her new classroom, preparing lessons for the following day, when the school's porter knocked on her door. The return to teaching had been both easier and harder than she'd expected. Easier, because her skills remained sharp and the children were eager to learn. Harder, because every young face reminded her of Tommy Rodriguez and the informal lessons she'd taught in Samuel's dining room. "Telegram for you, Miss Price," the porter said, handing her the yellow envelope with obvious curiosity. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened it, recognizing immediately the sender's identity from the originating office in Santa Fe. "Eleanor, stop. Samuel gravely ill. Stop. Pneumonia. Stop. Asking for you. Stop. Please come. Stop. Maria Santos." The words blurred before Eleanor's eyes as she read them again, trying to process their meaning. Samuel was dying. The man she'd left in anger and hurt was asking for her in what might be his final hours. Eleanor sank into her chair, the telegram fluttering to her desk like a fallen leaf. Despite everything that had passed between them, despite the will and the betrayal and her wounded pride, the thought of Samuel suffering alone made her chest tight with grief. She thought of him as she'd last seen him, standing on his porch in the morning light, watching her drive away. Had he been fighting illness even then? Had her departure weakened him when he needed strength to recover? The rational part of Eleanor's mind reminded her that she owed Samuel nothing, that his illness didn't change the fundamental issues that had driven her away. He had viewed her as expendable, had documented that view in legal terms, and no amount of deathbed regret could alter those facts. But the part of her heart that had learned to love him whispered different truths. It reminded her of quiet evenings by the fire, of his gentle defense of her dignity, of the way he'd looked at her when he'd confessed his feelings by the creek. It reminded her that love wasn't always perfect or calculated, that good people sometimes made thoughtless mistakes that didn't reflect their deepest intentions. Eleanor picked up the telegram and read it once more. Asking for you. What did that mean? Was Samuel delirious with fever, calling out names from his past? Or was he lucid, consciously requesting her presence for reasons she couldn't fathom? She looked around her new classroom-neat rows of desks, carefully arranged books, lesson plans, written in her precise handwriting on the chalkboard. This was the life she'd fought to reclaim, the independence and respect she'd sacrificed so much to regain. Leaving now, even temporarily, would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. But as Eleanor sat in the growing dusk, watching shadows lengthen across the schoolroom floor, she realized that none of those practical considerations mattered. Samuel was dying, and despite everything that had passed between them, she couldn't bear the thought of him facing that final journey alone. She rose from her desk with sudden decision and began gathering her things. There was a late stage that left for Santa Fe, and if she hurried, she could catch it. The school board would have to understand her they wouldn't, and she would face those consequences when she returned. If she returned, the journey back to Santa Fe passed in a haze of worry and second-guessing. Eleanor clutched the telegram in her hands, reading it repeatedly as if the words might change or reveal hidden meanings. She thought of all the things she might say to Samuel if he was conscious enough to hear her, all the questions that remained unanswered between them. But mostly, she thought of the possibility that she might arrive too late, that Samuel might die without knowing she had come. The ranch house appeared in the darkness like a beacon, its windows glowing with warm light that suggested a household keeping vigil. Eleanor's heart pounded as the hired carriage rolled up the familiar drive, past the barn where Samuel had shown her his workshop, past the creek where they had declared their love for each other. Maria Santos met her at the door, her kind face etched with exhaustion and relief. "Señorita Eleanor, gracias a Dios you have come. He has been asking for you, even in his fever dreams." "How is he?" Eleanor asked, setting down her bag and following Maria through the house that still felt like home despite everything. "Very ill. The doctor comes twice daily, but—" Maria shrugged eloquently. "He fights, but he is weak. The loneliness, it made him vulnerable to the sickness." They climbed the stairs. Eleanor had descended in anger just weeks before, but now her footsteps were guided by concern rather than wounded pride. At Samuel's bedroom door, Maria paused. "He may not recognize you at first. The fever makes him confused sometimes. But, Señorita, I think he has been waiting for you to come home." Home. The word echoed in Eleanor's mind as Maria opened the door, and she saw Samuel for the first time in 3 weeks. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by illness and the weight of the blankets that covered his shivering form. His face was flushed with fever, his breathing labored, his usually neat hair damp with perspiration. But his eyes, when they found hers across the dim room, were lucid and filled with an emotion that took her breath away. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You came." She approached his bedside slowly, uncertain of her welcome, despite Maria's summons. "I received the telegram. I had to." I couldn't stay away. Samuel tried to raise himself on his pillows, but fell back, exhausted by the effort. I thought I'd lost you forever. Eleanor pulled a chair close to his bed and sat down, close enough to see the fever burning in his eyes, close enough to hear his labored breathing. Samuel, you need to rest. Save your strength. No, he said with surprising firmness. Eleanor, I need to tell you about the will, about why I never changed it. I need you to understand before. Before what? Eleanor asked, though she dreaded the answer. Samuel's eyes met hers with painful honesty. Before I lose the chance to tell you the truth. Samuel's breathing was shallow as he struggled to find the words that might bridge the chasm between them. Eleanor sat perfectly still beside his bed, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for explanations that might come too late. The will, Samuel began, his voice barely above a whisper. I never changed it because I was afraid. Eleanor leaned closer, straining to hear him over the sound of wind rattling the windows. Afraid of what? Afraid that if I made it real, if I put your name beside mine in legal documents, if I acknowledged what we were building together, it might somehow break the spell. That you might realize you deserved better than a lonely old rancher and his empty house. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. Samuel, that's foolish, I know. He managed a weak smile. But Eleanor, I'd lost Margaret. I'd watched her fade away despite every prayer, every promise, every hope I could offer. When happiness found me again with you, I was terrified of jinxing it by being too presumptuous. So you left me out of your will to protect our relationship. Samuel's hand moved restlessly on the blanket, seeking hers. Eleanor hesitated, then covered his fever-hot fingers with her cool ones. I left you out because I couldn't bear to imagine a future without you in it. Changing the will would have meant acknowledging the possibility that you might leave, that you might die, that what we had might end. I was superstitious and stupid, and a coughing fit seized him, violent and prolonged. Eleanor held his hand while he fought for breath, her heart racing with fear that she might lose him before understanding was reached between them. When the coughing subsided, Samuel's grip on her hand tightened with surprising strength. Eleanor, I need you to know the money I set aside for you in that will. It wasn't payment for services. It was. He paused, struggling for words. It was the largest sum I could imagine, you needing to be independent, to never have to depend on anyone's charity again. I thought I was protecting your freedom. My freedom, Eleanor repeated softly. I never wanted you to feel trapped with me. If something happened, if you decided you couldn't stay, I wanted you to have enough to go anywhere, do anything, be anyone you chose to be. Eleanor stared at their joined hands, seeing their relationship through this new lens. You weren't reducing me to hired help. You were trying to ensure I always had a choice. Yes. Samuel's eyes closed briefly, exhaustion overwhelming him. But I see now how it looked, how it made you feel. Eleanor, I'm so sorry. I should have talked to you about it, should have explained my thinking. I should have trusted you with my fears, instead of letting them drive my decisions. Eleanor felt the last of her anger drain away, replaced by a grief so profound it took her breath. Here was the truth she'd been seeking, not the calculated coldness she'd feared, but a misguided attempt at protection born from love and loss. Samuel, she whispered, you should have told me. I know, and I'm sorry. But Eleanor, I need you to know what I felt for you, what I still feel. It was never about the arrangement. It was never about getting an heir. Somewhere in those quiet evenings, those shared meals, those moments when you'd look up from your book and smile at me, somewhere in all of that, I fell completely, hopelessly in love with you. Eleanor lifted their joined hands to her cheek, feeling the heat of his fever against her skin. I fell in love with you too, Samuel. That's why the will hurt so much, because I thought it meant you didn't really see me, didn't really value what we'd built together. I valued it so much I was afraid to make it official, Samuel said, his voice growing stronger with the urgency of confession. Eleanor, if I live through this, will you give me another chance? Will you let me write a new will that reflects how I truly see you as my partner, my equal, the other half of my heart? Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, but her words were cut off by a commotion downstairs. Voices, urgent and concerned, carried up through the floorboards. "What's happening?" Samuel tried to sit up, but Eleanor gently pressed him back against his pillows. "I don't know. I'll go see." But before she could rise, Maria appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with excitement and something that looked like joy. "Señorita Eleanor, Señor Samuel the doctor. He is here with news about Señorita Eleanor's condition." Eleanor frowned, confused. "My condition? Maria, I'm not ill." "No, Señorita, not ill. But the doctor, he has examined you while you slept last night, when you were so tired from the journey. He wanted to be certain before he spoke." Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. "Examined me for what?" Maria's smile was radiant. "Señorita Eleanor, you are with child. The baby she comes in the spring." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Eleanor felt Samuel's hand tighten on hers, felt her own heart stop, and then begin racing. A baby. Their baby, conceived in love rather than arrangement, created during those precious weeks when they'd believed in their future together. "Eleanor," Samuel breathed, and she heard wonder in his voice, hope strong enough to fight off the fever that had been consuming him. She turned to look at him, seeing color returning to his cheeks, seeing life kindling in his eyes at this news that changed everything. "Our baby," she whispered, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled with unguarded joy. Samuel struggled to sit up, and this time Eleanor helped him, supporting his shoulders as he faced her directly. "Eleanor Price," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word, "will you marry me? Not because of arrangements or agreements or practical considerations, but because I love you and you're carrying my child, and I want to spend whatever time God grants me making you happy." Eleanor looked at this man who had given her a home, who had defended her dignity, who had loved her imperfectly but sincerely. She thought of the baby growing within her, a child who would be born into love rather than obligation. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Samuel Beckett, I'll marry you." The sound that filled the room then was unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard. It was the cry of new life beginning, of hope being born, of two people choosing love over fear and trust over doubt. It was the sound of their real life together finally beginning. 1 year later, Eleanor stood on the front porch of the Beckett Ranch, watching the sunrise paint the eastern hills in shades of gold and rose. In her arms, baby Margaret, named for Samuel's first wife at Eleanor's, insistence gurgled contentedly. Her tiny fist wrapped around Eleanor's finger with the determined grip that had characterized her from birth. The child was beautiful, with Eleanor's dark eyes and Samuel's stubborn chin, and a disposition that suggested she would be both intelligent and strong-willed. At 3 months old, she already showed signs of the curiosity that Eleanor hoped would serve her well in life. "Good morning, little one," Eleanor murmured, adjusting the soft blanket around her daughter. "Shall we see if Papa is ready for breakfast?" Samuel appeared in the doorway behind her, fully recovered from the pneumonia that had nearly claimed his life. The illness had aged him, added lines around his eyes and silver to his hair, but it had also stripped away the last vestiges of the careful reserve he'd maintained during their early months together. He loved openly now, without fear or calculation, and the change had transformed him into a man Eleanor barely recognized from their first meeting at the church steps. "How are my girls this morning?" he asked, wrapping his arms around both of them from behind. Eleanor leaned back against his chest, marveling at how natural this felt, the three of them together. A family formed not from necessity, but from choice and love and the miracle of new life. "Margaret slept through the night again," Eleanor reported. "I think she's finally settling into a proper routine. Takes after her mother, organized and determined to do things properly." Eleanor smiled at the gentle teasing. Their marriage, celebrated quietly in the Santa Fe church just 2 weeks after his recovery, had been everything their original arrangement had, not based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the shared joy of anticipating their child together. Samuel had indeed written a new will, but this time Eleanor had helped draft it. The document now reflected their true partnership, their property held jointly, their child provided for by both parents, and Eleanor's position as Samuel's wife and partner legally secured. More importantly, they had talked through every provision, every contingency, ensuring that there would be no more painful surprises hidden in legal documents. "I have something for you," Samuel said, releasing them to retrieve a leather-bound book from the table inside. Eleanor recognized it immediately. New Family Bible, its pages crisp and unmarked, except for the inscription Samuel had written on the first page. "The Beckett family," she read aloud. "Samuel Beckett, born 1829. Eleanor Price Beckett, born 1842. Margaret Eleanor Beckett, born 1888. Below their names, Samuel had added a line that made Eleanor's throat tight with emotion. "A family formed by choice, blessed by love, united in purpose." "Our names," Eleanor said softly. "All of us together." "Where they belong," Samuel confirmed. "Where they'll stay for generations to come." Eleanor traced their daughter's name with her finger, thinking of all the changes the past year had brought. The baby had been born healthy and strong during a surprisingly easy delivery, attended by Dr. Martinez from Santa Fe, and blessed by Maria's experienced care. Samuel had been present for the birth unconventional, but insisted upon by both parents, and Eleanor would never forget the expression on his face when he first held his daughter. The ranch had prospered under their joint management, with Eleanor's organizational skills complementing Samuel's business instincts. More importantly, they had created something larger than a successful cattle operation. They had built a home where love was spoken freely and children were welcome. Tommy Rodriguez, now 9, still came for regular lessons, joined by his younger sister and several other children from neighboring ranches. Eleanor had established a proper school in the large dining room, with Samuel's enthusiastic support and financial backing. She found teaching even more fulfilling now that it came from choice rather than necessity, and she took particular pleasure in watching her students' progress without the constraints of narrow-minded school boards. "Mrs. Morrison sent another letter," Samuel said, settling into a chair beside Eleanor. "Sarah graduated from Teachers College with highest honors. She's been offered a position at the territorial capital, but she wants to thank you for inspiring her to pursue education." Eleanor smiled, remembering the bright girl who had asked such thoughtful questions. "She would have succeeded with or without my influence. Some children are simply born to achieve great things." "As will our Margaret," Samuel said, reaching over to stroke his daughter's soft cheek. "With parents like hers, she'll have every opportunity to become whatever she chooses to be." Eleanor looked down at their baby, seeing infinite possibility in her sweet face. Margaret would grow up secure and loved, raised by parents who valued both education and character. She would never know the uncertainty Eleanor had experienced, never face the choice between principle and security that had once seemed so stark. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked, noting Eleanor's contemplative expression. "About how unexpected life can be," Eleanor replied. "A year ago, I thought I'd lost everything, my career, my dignity, my chance at happiness. I was angry and hurt, and convinced that trust was too dangerous a luxury. And now," Eleanor looked around at the home they'd built together, not just the house with its comfortable rooms and warm hearth, but the life they'd created within its walls. The teaching that fulfilled her, the partnership that strengthened them both, the child who represented their love made manifest. "Now I understand that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as disasters. If I hadn't lost my teaching position, I never would have met you. If you hadn't needed an heir, we never would have found each other. If I hadn't discovered that will and left in anger, we might never have been forced to examine what we really meant to each other." Samuel reached for her free hand, intertwining their fingers as he had that first morning in his workshop. "Do you ever regret it, the path that brought us here?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, thinking of all the pain and uncertainty they'd endured to reach this moment of peace. "I regret the hurt we caused each other," she said finally. "I regret the time we wasted being afraid of our own feelings. But I don't regret the journey, Samuel. Every difficult step led us to this, to our family, our love, our life together. Margaret stirred in Eleanor's arms, opening dark eyes that seemed to take in the world with serious attention. Samuel leaned over to kiss his daughter's forehead, then Eleanor's cheek, his actions speaking the devotion that no longer needed words to express. "Shall we go in?" Eleanor asked as the sun climbed higher, promising another day of the happiness she'd never dared expect. "Yes," Samuel said, standing and offering Eleanor his arm. "Let's begin another day of our real life together." As they walked into the house, husband, wife, and child, Eleanor felt the deep satisfaction of a woman who had found her place in the world. Behind them, the New Mexico sunrise painted the landscape in brilliant colors, illuminating a future bright with promise and love freely given. Their story had begun with an arrangement born of desperation, but it had become something far more precious, a testament to the power of love, to transform even the most unlikely circumstances into something beautiful and lasting. In choosing each other again and again, despite fear and misunderstanding and wounded pride, they had created not just a family, but a legacy of hope that would endure for generations to come.